My name is Tyson Choptain. I'm the Vice President of Broadview Networks, and I'm going to be joined today by John Martinook, our Manager of Security Services, and Peter Svoboda, Director of Engineering from LCM Security. And today we're going to talk about how to build a cybersecurity business plan. And really what we want to focus on is a little bit about the why we need to build security plans, the how you're going to do it, and then a little bit of the technologies that are involved in the process of building a cybersecurity plan and understanding what your risk is as an organization. We are using today the format of Microsoft Teams, webinar format. So we do have the ability for people to provide live reactions, and you can also raise your hand to ask a question or get our attention. You can use the chat window as a mechanism to ask a question or reach out or gather our attention. And we can, if you'd like to speak live, either on camera or by voice, we can unmute you or allow the ability for your camera to be turned on if you'd like to have a little bit of a more interactive discussion. Probably more at the end, but certainly feel free to ask questions throughout. So as I mentioned today, I'm joined by John Martinook. He's our Senior Security Analyst at Broadview Networks. He provides our virtual information security officer service as well. And John has a long list of security certifications, both vendor-specific Microsoft security certifications, for example, and then non-vendor specific certifications from a number of organizations that provide cybersecurity assessment, auditing, and remediation services that have method by which to measure the knowledge someone has in the cybersecurity industry, and something that John's been working on for a long time, and we're very happy to have him as a part of the team building out our cybersecurity portfolio. My name again is Tyson Choptain. I'm an Executive Vice President of Broadview Networks. I'm one of the founders of Broadview Networks. I've been in just about every role in the organization at some point over the last 20 years, and my primary role today is to act as the Managing Director of Broadview Networks and as our virtual Chief Information Officer for our customers, helping them understanding what their best strategic technology needs are as an organization and assisting our customers in building long-term technology roadmaps and budgets. So I want to talk a little bit about how we approach cybersecurity, and it really is built on a number of pillars, and you'll see these pillars and how we talk about many different types of technology services that we deliver for cybersecurity. Technology is important. It's critical. We can't properly deliver cybersecurity services without technology, but the technology without process and a reason to use the technology will not provide you with an enhanced cybersecurity posture. It'll provide you with a bunch of tools and a bunch of technology that are doing things but aren't necessarily achieving what you need to achieve, because you have to understand what you need to achieve first. And that's really the assessment side of things and the road mapping that Peter's going to talk about a little bit. John's going to focus a little bit more on the technologies, but both of those involve people and a philosophy. And the people are really everyone in your organization that's involved at various different levels. Those who implement your cybersecurity protection, make your cybersecurity posture robust, and then those who use your technology and really are the biggest risk to your organization in many ways. But the core philosophy you need to have needs to be based on some sort of a framework, some sort of core understanding of what you're going to do to make sure that cybersecurity is understood and a critical component of your organization. I'm going to talk a little bit about the why to start off. And many people might know this. We have a wide range of different people on today's session. Some have a lot of deep knowledge about the cybersecurity risk, some have less. But I never want to hesitate to talk about the risk that is out there. There's articles, a variety of articles out there. This is one of my favorites that talks about how large cyber crime is going to be by 2025. And the number that's being talked about now for a little while is around a $10 trillion industry or $10 trillion organized crime venture. And just to put that in perspective, at $10 trillion, that's a bigger GDP than Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, India, France, or Italy. So worldwide, the cyber crime potential by 2025 of what the cyber criminals are going to basically earn in their venture, that, and many of them look at it as a venture, is going to be the GDP of the third largest country in the world, basically. And that's a very scary concept as to how large a potential earn there is for cyber criminals to get into cyber crime if they're not into it already, to expand what they're doing, and to attack individuals and organizations to try to extract money from them. And while $10 trillion is a really big number, and 2025 seems like it might be a little bit far away, I don't want people to lose focus on the fact that this hits here in Winnipeg, in our customer segments all the time on a regular basis. It's not just hitting really big companies. It's not just hitting the Microsofts of the world. It's not just hitting the Googles of the world. It's not just hitting the Cargills or the Walmarts, certainly hitting them as well. It's hitting organizations that have 2 users, 5 users, 25 users, 50 users, 500 users, 5,000 users. It doesn't matter. The cyber criminals do not discriminate. And in many ways, the smaller customers are easier targets for them because they're generally less protected, and their users usually aren't as well educated and don't understand what of their actions provide the risks to enable a cyber criminal to access your environment, do something to your environment that gives them a mechanism by which to try to get money from you. Whether it be ransomware, whether it be some other cybercrime activity, they are going to try to do something that forces you to give them money based on actions taken on technology by your end users, usually more than anything else. And there are a number of ways we can protect ourselves from this happening. And certainly when we talk about the assessment and the tools that John and Peter are going to talk about, that definitely lays out the framework for how you build a plan to protect yourself. But let's just talk a little bit about the type of protection we're looking for today, compared to maybe the type of protection we think we have or think we need or we've been looking at in the past. For those of you that see this, it looks very much like Age of Empires, one of my favorite video games of all time. And, for a long time in games like Age of Empires and very much in the cybercrime world, we had a wall, our firewall or our perimeter defense mechanism. We had people protecting that wall. In this case, it's archers. In case of a firewall, it's the rules you put in place. We knew that everyone was trying to get in the front gate or climb up the wall to get in. We had very specific ways we could put rules and practices and policies and people in place to protect it. And we were in a very good place with what we would consider nowadays a very simple and rudimentary protection level. That's not the case today. Today, we have global warfare, basically, from a cybercrime perspective. We have spy satellites, we have fighter planes, we have bombers, we have all different kinds of ground infantry, we have tanks rolling up. Really, there is no mechanism by which you can, no single mechanism by which you can protect an organization in place. Perimeter protection, a bunch of guys standing at a wall looking down at what's on the ground. It's going to miss everything overhead. It's going to miss the people trying to tunnel in underneath. It's going to miss the people that are just, throwing stuff over the wall and landing it inside your castle. That's what we need to be considering today. All of these different levels of risk, all the different ways that an organization is and can be exposed, and where the vulnerabilities come from, and how we properly protect all those different levels and the people and the processes that go with it to be able to leverage the technology to build a robust cybersecurity solution for your organization, which starts with a robust cybersecurity plan. Just to understand that most businesses are seeing this, it is considered one of the top 5 reasons that the World Economic Forum has received back from respondents as a risk for an organization, whether it be in the SMB space, the medium space, the enterprise space. We constantly hear back from C-level executives, from IT professionals in organizations. Cybersecurity is one of our biggest concerns. Yeah, obviously infectious disease is a pretty big concern these days, given what we went through with COVID and the impact it has. Before that, it was quite a bit lower. Extreme weather events, fire, famine, flood, those are always risks that are out there, but cybersecurity is right up in that top 5, and that's a very good indicator of how present it is on the minds of the executives of organizations because of the risk that is out there. This slide is really helpful to talk about a couple of different things. It gives us an idea of where the cyber criminals are operating. You may have seen this slide or heard this talked about before. There's the World Wide Web, the part that most of us interact with, the BravoNetworks.ca, the CNN.com, the YouTubes of the world that are the tip of the iceberg. And then below that, there's the deep web. There's, research, government, subscription-based services, and then below that there's the dark web, the more nefarious part of the internet, where we see a lot of illegal activity happening. And those are very accurate representations of the internet. But this is also a very accurate representation, kind of how a cybersecurity attack takes place. Because by the time we see it, if you don't have good protection in place, you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. And you don't even realize what's been happening under the water, growing and expanding within your organization, potentially for weeks, months, even longer, putting your organization at risk. And we really want to be able to help you put together a plan, or have you put together your own plan that allows you to understand how to put in the right technology, processes, people, all of those things, so that you're able to see this iceberg at its full size before it hits you and before you're impacted by it. And that's really how we see protecting an organization. Just to reiterate, cybercrime today is not some kids in the basement writing scripts. It's not war games. It's not hackers and the movies we saw growing up about, cybercrime and what it could be. It's none of those things. It is highly organized, structured criminal organizations. It is full-blown criminal activity, larger than the worldwide drug trade. There are a lot of people making a lot of money, investing a lot of money to try to get money from you. And it's become so significant that we are now seeing insurers and industries becoming uninsurable. Some industries are either just being refused cybersecurity insurance outright, or the cost of the cybersecurity insurance is almost prohibitive to be able to do it, especially if they haven't put the right frameworks, plans, processes, technology, and people in place. This has gone to the point where Lloyd's will no longer include nation-state attacks in its cyber insurance policies. So they are simply saying the amount of attacks we see, not just from the cyber criminals, but from nation-state attacks, is going to limit what we can do from a cybersecurity insurance perspective. But it's not going to necessarily limit your risk, depending on the type of organization you're in or what you do. So that's a little bit of the fear, and it's a rational fear because we do see and live this fear on a regular basis when it comes to fruition, when someone does get attacked. Now, I'm going to throw up a bit of an eye chart talking about all the different things we can help you do, and you could do independently on your own, to accomplish building out a proper cybersecurity response portfolio in your organization. The ones highlighted in yellow are usually the first targeted items. A lot of that has to do with the items that are generally linked to cybersecurity insurance requirements. So we see multi-factor authentication, alignment to a security framework, vulnerability assessment and management, managed backup and DR, patch management, cybersecurity awareness training. These are items that we see that the cybersecurity insurance providers have targeted as primary items you need to have an answer or a solution for in your organization to be able to receive cybersecurity insurance. Some of the other items that are on this list help fill out your cybersecurity portfolio and help you maintain it and manage it longer term and put a deeper level of protection in place. How do we start? Well, the simplest way to start is to plan. It's the best way to start anything. Before you build something, before you decide what you're going to do, you need a plan. And the best way to get a plan is to assess where you're at. Before you can plan what you want, you need to give an idea of what you think it is you might want to do and understand what you currently have. And we've partnered with LCM Security with a lot of the assessment work we've done. We do some assessment work ourselves, but Paul and Peter's team at LCM have built a very well-defined practice in helping organizations assess and develop a roadmap and remediate their cybersecurity posture. So, Peter, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Tyson. Yeah, hey everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well here. Overall, yeah, it's so important to align against one of these security frameworks, right? So there's going to be a few of them that we're going to be talking about here. There's many out there. The three most common ones are some of the ones that we're going to have up on the slides here. First one being ISO. The ISO series, most common one referred to as is the ISO 27001. So generally speaking, this is quite a large framework still. In terms of benefits, pros, cons, it's a lot of times overkill for what an organization needs. So, if you're trying to decide which framework to align to, ISO is probably not the best one if you're in that state, unless you have some specific requirements. Maybe your vendors or your customers or someone is really forcing you down this path. That's the only time you should really be looking at ISO. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit too much for you to chew. So if you could throw up the next slide, please, Tyson. NIST. This is the next kind of. This one is extremely common. It's adapted by the U.S. government primarily, and a number of organizations trying to follow suit. It's got the 800-53 framework. There's also NIST CSF. There's a few kind of NIST frameworks under this umbrella, where it's good idea to align against something like this, but it's still kind of open to interpretation, right? The way the controls are structured, it's kind of open to interpretation by the person that's actually reading the control. It's not really as well structured, but it is a great framework to align to as well. Now, the one we recommend is the CIS, Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. This is a framework which is also very well known. Like I said, it's kind of part of those top threes, and it actually does a fantastic job in removing. It does a fantastic job in removing some of the ambiguities. I think I chopped up there for a second. I have been issues with my internet. Sorry about that. So the CIS controls, the framework actually does a great job in eliminating those ambiguities, and it's really kind of like a black and white. Like the controls are well defined, very little open to interpretation. It's kind of the standard that we usually recommend you should align against if you don't have any other frameworks in mind or specific mandates actually. Next slide, please. All right, life cycle approach to security, right? Tyson mentioned a little bit at the very beginning, people, process, and technology. This really needs to be at the core and the heart of everything you do from a security perspective. And this is exactly what our recommendations here are in terms of doing the assessment. We keep in mind the people, process, and technologies. And it really is the driving factor of everything we do. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do? You've now chosen a framework to align against, whether it's one of the top threes or some other framework, whatever the case is. That this general process works for all the frameworks, right? And it's going to start with doing that initial assessment. So what we primarily do in terms of doing the assessment is we'll from a time effort perspective, we need about 9 hours of your time to do an assessment of where you are. What are you doing right, wrong, and so on. So we spend about 9 hours with you really understanding that. It's primarily based on an interview process. And there's going to be kind of 3 deliverables that come out of that assessment. One is going to be your high level report of findings document, which just gives you that high level understanding of where you are, how do you stack up against other organizations, what are some of the major gaps we've uncovered, and so on. Really executive style report. The second type of deliverable, which you'll see some more specific slides coming up over the next 4 or 5 slides here, is the Excel worksheet document, right? So we'll also give you a document that you can use. It's an Excel format that kind of allows you to filter through all the gaps and assign priorities to everything, which is actually extremely important, right? Because you probably don't care as much about all the different gaps as much as having that plan and a project plan or a structure or a roadmap in place on what are the priorities, what do I need to do now, what can wait a month, 2 months, a year, maybe 2 years even. This becomes a journey. It's very rarely something that can be done over a span of a year even. Like we're talking about let's get something in place for you that's going to span 2 or 3 years, and make sure you understand what are all the different steps you need to take. So by doing these assessments, we give you that Excel document that aligns all the different projects into categories and such. More on that a little bit later. But everything is scored on a scale between 0 and 5 as well, right? So there's maturity ratings that get assigned to everything. Because as simple as it is to answer a question, let's say do you have a firewall? The answer is yes or no. But the reality is the answer to that is so much more than just a binary yes/no answer. Do you have first of all, is it deployed across the whole environment? Are the firewalls strict? Do you have policies and procedures to back it up, and so on and so on, right? So all this really translates into being able to score yourself on a maturity model rating basis. So we use the common maturity model to score assessments. You'll also have that average score for the entire assessment based on this as well. And really high level, once again, it's are you doing what's required? Are you not? Is it ad hoc? Is it fully implemented? Do you have policies? Do you have procedures? And then from there on, you kind of towards the 4s and the 5s, which are the maximum scores. The questions become, do you have a process of continuous optimization? Are you thinking about automation? Do you, integrate tools to work together, and so on? So everything is scored against this. Next slide, please. All right, this is an example of that second deliverable I was talking about, right? So there's a total of 3. I think I actually haven't spoke about the third one yet. Once again, quick recap: you had the report of findings document, you have the Excel document, which is what you see up on your screen here. This is one of the sections within it. I'll talk to it a bit. I'll talk to it in a second. But I wanted to quickly recap on the third deliverable, which I have not mentioned yet, which kind of expands on those projects and the timelines and everything that's kind of set forth. You'll also have a budgetary idea of how much is it going to cost, and that's what the third document is all about. Is how can Broadview help? How can LCM help? We partner quite closely together, and together we're able to offer solutions for anything in any of these frameworks at the end of the day, right? So that is also a document you'll have out of that. But going back to the GRC dashboard, what is, this is one of those tabs that's actually within the Excel document I mentioned, and it allows you to keep track of your maturity over time, right? So let's say you score, it's your first time going through an assessment. It's very normal for organizations to score below a 1 out of 5. I would say it's quite common, actually. Not as much maybe these days. When we were doing assessment 4 or 5 years ago, the average was a 0.6 out of 5. Right now, the averages are around a 1.2, 1.3. So you can still see that that's pretty long way to go to the 5, right? So overall, this is still a concern. But one of the tools we provide to you in that Excel document is an ability to track your progress over time, and this is great for management as well, right? So the question always comes up: what have we paid all this money for? What are all these technologies we've implemented? This allows you to quantitatively measure what's been put in place. So the idea is you set yourself a goal, which is this blue line, and then you keep track of your progress over time, which would be this orange line that you see on here. So those tools are embedded in the Excel document, and it's all available for you to use to help you demonstrate what you've done over time. Next slide, please. All right, the implementation plan. I mentioned how we're prioritizing things for you. This is kind of another one of those tabs in one of the Excel documents, and it really, groups controls that are lacking into projects for you, right? So, it's one thing getting a report that just has 100 things that you need to do. That isn't easily approachable, easily to do, easily to plan against. So what we actually do is we group similar or like controls into projects for you. A lot of times, by implementing a specific type of technology, you're able to satisfy many controls. So this is the whole idea of creating this implementation plan for you. We're going to be grouping gaps into projects and prioritizing them for you as well. So what you see here is phases. You can this is supposed to resemble like a calendar type view as well. Doesn't really need to be a calendar, but it's designed this way so you can think of it that way. Like if you had a 2-year roadmap, let's say, to implement all this stuff, this is kind of what you'd be seeing here. Each of these phases becomes a quarter in the year, right? So phase 1, you have certain projects to undertake, then you move on to phase 2, 3, 4, and so on. So you now have an idea of, what you need to do over X amount of time. And I say X because it's always dependent on how much resources and time and effort and budgets you have to do things, and at what pace. What also falls into this is the third document is the budgets, right? Because it's good knowing which projects you have to undertake, but obviously the next question is how much is it going to cost, right? So those first 2 deliverables, the report of finding, the whole alignment against the framework, this Excel document, it's all vendor agnostic. But then when we start talking about budgets and how much is it going to cost, then we have to start naming technologies. So that's really where the third document comes in, and I oftentimes refer to it as the how can we help document, right? Because this is where we're going to be positioning Broadview services or LCM services to complement Broadview services. To give you an idea of how much is it going to cost to implement these projects, from a product perspective, or even people process perspective, all this is included as well. Next slide, please. Right, so that kind of summarizes the approach, how to do the assessments, how to get this roadmap in place, how can we help you get there, and it really comes down to this picture, really, right? You're really trying to outrun the bad guys. So the sooner you know the gaps, the sooner you know what needs to be put in, the better off you're going to be, and hopefully that's going to be sooner than someone has a chance to exploit that. And kind of on that note, I'm going to pass it over here to John to talk a little bit about some of the technologies associated with other things you guys can do.
Sounds good. Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everyone. As Peter mentioned and Tyson talked about earlier, right? We've chosen a framework. We've got a plan. In that plan, we need to address the people, process, and technology items. I'm going to speak more to the technology items and try and keep this as high level as possible without getting technical. But there's certain technology items that you can automate or implement quicker than others, so you're ahead of the guy running behind the bear there. The CIS-based assessments and scoring, there is actually a good chunk of it is based on what can you automate and to what degree are things automated. CIS is a fantastic framework and fantastic model to get this work done. We could talk about it for hours, but there's 2 or 3 areas that don't get as much attention and that we can extend to you and our customers as a CIS member. We're a CIS Secure Suite member, so we have access to a few other tools such as the benchmarks and build kits that would help you gain that basic cyber hygiene and do the minimum recommended practices to get you further ahead of other people and other businesses. One of them, and I'll start with, is the CIS benchmarks. CIS has over 200 benchmarks covering 25 plus different product families, and they're best practice guides on how you should securely configure services, servers, applications, and more. Some of the most popular benchmarks include the benchmark for Azure and Microsoft 365, for your Windows workstations, servers, and more. These benchmarks aren't just a Google search, a checklist of, I should turn this on, turn this off. These are benchmarks that are put together by global cybersecurity experts. These benchmarks come from experts that are on the ground, seeing the most common attacks, and are trying to help us defend against those most common attacks. So we'll go to the next slide here, please. For those that have dealt with benchmarks in the past, anyone could register, create a CIS account for free, and download the text document of those benchmarks. You can get the PDF of the benchmarks. And for example, the Windows Server benchmark, it's over 1,000 pages. The benchmark for Microsoft 365 is over 300 pages. I don't know about you, but most people don't have the time to spend hours, days, weeks going through those documents and manually configuring things. That's where the membership and automation comes into play. Just one other quick point about these benchmarks is they're constantly being updated. So as the bad actors change their tactics and techniques, and as different security threats evolve or new ones are created, these benchmarks are updated quite regularly to reflect how can we defend against those and how do we increase our basic security hygiene. These benchmarks have 2 levels. As mentioned, right, we can talk hours about CIS. In the overall CIS framework, there's actually 3 levels. There's implementation groups 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 is considered your basic cyber hygiene, essentially steps everyone should take regardless of size, location, data. A group 2 assessment really focuses on organizations that have more sensitive data, multiple locations, and have a bit more resources in terms of people, time, and funds. Level 3 is meant for those organizations that are specifically targeted. So for example, law firms, medical organizations, organizations that manufacture products for government or defense, right? They have a higher attack profile and they're going to be targeted by those nation state actors. And as Tyson mentioned, right, insurers aren't going to cover you if you're in a certain category. So these benchmarks have multiple levels that align to the implementation group that you're assessing and planning for. In terms of a bit more information on plans, when we do our CIS assessment, if we're doing a group 1 assessment, you're typically provided with a 1-year plan. If we do a group 2 assessment, you're typically given a 2-year plan. Again, as Peter mentioned, that depends on the resources and scheduling and product availability and more, but they typically follow that path. Generally speaking, when we assess your overall environment, at a minimum, we also like to assess your Microsoft 365 environment. Yes, there's a few people and customers using some of the Google Business Suite services, but generally speaking, most people are using Microsoft 365. So one of our favorite benchmarks, and a benchmark we've done close to 100 times, is the benchmark for Microsoft 365. It covers your identity, so your accounts and authentication. It covers application permissions in the service, data and storage, email security, so configuring Defender for Office, protecting your mailboxes, auditing, and more. If you take the zero trust approach, it's a bit of a buzzword, it's been around for years. There's different components of zero trust that you want to protect. We always want to protect identities first. Looking at the slides earlier, right, Tyson talked about that traditional firewall or perimeter or guards on the fence. That doesn't exist anymore. It's still important, but it's not as important today because people work from anywhere, right? You can connect from anywhere, you can work from anywhere, give me internet and I can function. So protecting identity is really key. And then we get into protecting endpoints and storage, your applications and more. Second benchmark we want to highlight is the benchmark for Azure. Microsoft 365 uses Azure Active Directory for your identities, and applications. Some of you may also have resources in Microsoft Azure, which is where you can create virtual servers, storage, and other items in the cloud, in addition to the productivity suite. The benchmark for Azure, again, covers identity. It covers Defender for cloud services, which is Defender for your servers, Defender for your databases, Defender for your storage, and more. There's recommendations for database services in Azure, how you should log and monitor items, configuring the network in a secure fashion so things are just not openly exposed to the internet, recommendations for the virtual machines or servers you have in the cloud, and other application services. We'll go to the next slide here, please. There's also benchmarks for clients and servers. So kind of going back to how we get started and how do you become, how are you reacting faster than the other guys? By assessing against these benchmarks and then applying the build kits, which we'll talk to you in a moment, you can configure these settings in a very automated, quick fashion. But just to wrap up the benchmarks, when it comes to Windows clients and servers, the benchmark is looking at your user account policies, local policies related to security settings. Again, you'll see a common theme, right, of identity and logging. What privileged groups are restricted, what services are allowed to run, how is the file system, how are services and files configured in a safe way, is the firewall on, is the network configured in a secure fashion, are there any software or application controls in place? In auditing, we can't stress this enough. Protecting identities and auditing in case an identity or service is compromised is so important. Without those logs, without auditing configured, how do you respond, right? How do you take all of this information, put it in an incident response plan, and identify things quicker, respond quicker? Let's move past these benchmarks. You can see that the client benchmarks and the server benchmarks, they cover many of the same categories. There's benchmarks for Windows servers, there's benchmark for Windows clients like Windows 10 and 11, and all of that can be managed in Intune as well. So if you're using Intune, which is part of Business Premium or the higher Microsoft licensing, we can take these same benchmarks and settings and apply them, whether it's group policy or whether it's Intune. The second CIS feature I want to talk about is the CIS hardened images. Think of these as templates or pre-configured virtual servers. These hardened images are available on Azure, Google, Amazon. They're on the major cloud service providers. They take all the weaknesses in the operating systems and give you a secure hardened operating system within seconds. All of these virtual images, they're pre-configured to meet the recommendations in the benchmarks we just talked about and give you 2 levels to cover them against. We'll move forward here. Even better, kind of like how CIS is a global recognized framework, so insurers recognize CIS, these images available in the cloud service providers that CIS provides, they're recognized by significant organizations and players in the industry. They're recognized by the Department of Defense, federal organizations, health and insurance organizations, NIST, as we talked about, and other frameworks like the Payment Card Industry Standard. So again, this is not, John said, LCM said, Google said, right? These are globally accepted images that are pre-configured. We talked about there's different levels in the benchmark. Well, if you like, now, of course, there's a cost, very minor cost associated with these, but in seconds, you can go into the Azure Marketplace and you could spin up a new virtual server that's pre-configured and hardened to the level of your choosing. There's a minor cost, as you can see in this example. A Server 22 virtual machine configured to level 1 is 2 cents per hour. That is going to be significantly cheaper than the days, weeks, etc. it would take to manually configure these items. Let's move ahead here. Another tool I wanted to share. So we've talked about CIS and we've talked about different frameworks, right? We can be framework agnostic, we could be vendor agnostic. We truly highly recommend the CIS benchmark for Microsoft 365, but we wanted to share another tool and project. So many organizations have so much sensitive data and identities in the Microsoft Cloud services that we wanted to bring this project forward as well. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency has created a project called SCUBA. It stands for Secure Cloud Business Applications. Once again, it covers Google, it covers Amazon, but we'll focus on Microsoft 365. Like CIS has benchmarks and frameworks developed for global agencies, CISA has a project that provides you with guidance on how to configure your cloud environment. They're intended for government organizations, but they can be applied to organizations of all sizes. CISA took these security configurations and they piloted them with all their different agencies. They vetted them just like CIS does. And now there's baselines for Azure, Defender for Office, your Exchange mailboxes, OneDrive and SharePoint, for storage and documents, the Power Platform and Teams and more. We'll go to the next slide here. Like the CIS benchmarks, there's recommendations and baselines provided to you. You could run this tool with very little technical knowledge and get these baseline reports in 10 minutes or less. It's going to show you how your tenant conforms or not to CISA's standards. And for each of the areas, Azure, Microsoft Defender, Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams, you're going to see, where did I pass? Are there warnings? Where did I fail? And then it also provides manual guidance. There's over 50 automated tasks, over 150 areas that SCUBA provides guidance on. We'll go to the next slide here. Just to summarize and bundle all of what the technical aspects I talked to together, as mentioned, right, you really have to start with a framework. Our recommendation, and in many of these examples, that's the CIS framework. You assess against that framework, you identify your gaps, and then you write a prioritized plan to address those gaps. That plan isn't go out and buy 100 tools. That's, where are we today? What do we have? What can we leverage? Remediate those items up front. Okay, now where do we go next? What are the people, process, technology items what we have to add to improve our security scoring and posture? Typically, whether it's CIS, NIST, your cyber insurer, those remediation items are going to involve numbers 3 to 10 here. If I had to summarize 3 to 10, it's really multi-factor everywhere. Basic traditional antivirus does not cut it. You need advanced detection and response. So something like a Defender for Endpoint, SentinelOne. Those security products and your logging, they need to be backed by a SOC, which is a security operations center. They're monitoring those services. They're looking at those logs and they're analyzing them for suspicious behavior, irregular activity, creating alerts with different severities to react on. Without logs and eyes on those logs, you could be breached for hundreds of days without knowing. And then there's some really basic cyber site hygiene items, right? We need to patch everything. Kind of like MFA everywhere, we need to patch everything as soon as possible because there's vulnerabilities discovered daily and weekly. For those incidents where there's not, there's no solution or we need to revert to backup, we have to have very carefully planned and tested backups. We actually need to, 1, backup, and 2, actually test them. And then you get into the people side of things, right? There's technology, those administering that technology and making that technology more secure. And then there's people using that technology. Cybersecurity is truly everyone's responsibility. We need to train IT folks. We need to train users. We need to train executives and those high value targets and more. And lastly, it's not a matter of if, it's when. So how quickly do you detect an issue and how do you respond to that issue? And those are really key regardless of framework or, cyber insurers requirements.
Thanks, John. And thanks very much to Peter
Thank you.
for joining us today as well. And so we have some time left.